Today, I want to talk about school budgets in terms of the larger picture. I want to talk a little bit about where schools get their money and how they spend that money. Again, in very broad terms today. Now, oftentimes we think of school finance in terms of there's this endless pile of money that we can automatically use to do everything that we want. But the reality is, whether you're in a public school or you're in a private school, the challenges that administrators face today are at a critical point. You see, in the public school, they are funded by three basic sources of revenue. They're funded by the federal government, they're funded by the state government, and third is the local government. Now, oftentimes when people think about education and educational funding and policies, they automatically think it's the federal government. The federal government, they're the ones that are leading the charge. The reality is that the federal government in most states only provides less than 9.5% of the total budgets for the public school system in any particular state. When you suddenly start thinking about that, you suddenly start thinking, well, wait a minute. Aren't they the ones that are telling us what we should do in terms of our policies? The answer is yes and no. They generally give guidelines. They will give the legal interpretation of things. But the funding that keeps our schools going is really the state funding and the local. Most states are funded at an average of about 45% of the school budgets by the state. And about 44% is funded by the local government. Now, when we start talking about property taxes, that really goes into the local portion of the funding. But when you start looking at the sources of revenue for public schools, those sources change each year based upon the allocation of funds by the state legislature or by the local city or county. Now, that's a challenge for most school systems. Why? Because if suddenly the election changes in a particular year, and those that are now in power suddenly say, we think our teachers are getting paid too much, and as a result, we're going to withdraw either local or state money, where do the individual schools find the money? They don't have the option of going out and saying, well, we need to start this new program, even though we think it's vital to our mission. They can't simply go out and say, well, we want the local or the state government to pay for it. It's a long, drawn-out process. So, what does that mean? It means that the administrators at the school level have to plan. They have to plan for new programs, for new facilities, well in advance. You simply can't go to a conference and say, I heard a great speaker, and I think I want to start that in my school next year. That might sound like a great thing, but the question is, how do you get the money to fund that? And that's one of the things that we're going to talk about. And that is, how do you allocate the money? The money that you're given, how do you use those funds? Now, in a private school setting, your primary source of revenue is your tuition. Now, that's a good and a bad thing. Because you can say, well, this is our tuition and this is what we're going to spend it on, with little interference from state or local governments. It's your board or your pastor if it's a local school, Catholic school. Now, the challenge really is to say, in a private or a Catholic school, what sources of revenues outside of tuition? Because when you suddenly start looking at the cost per pupil and the revenue that we have coming in, they don't always match. But one of the things that is crucial, if you are a school administrator, and that is you must have a clear vision for what you want your school to be, what programs will help you accomplish that, what allocation of resources needs to go to hiring the best teachers that you can. Now, oftentimes we think of schools as, well, it's really just about paying the teachers and their salaries and benefits. But it's much different than that. Because there are so many things that happen outside of that, that you as an administrator, when you're developing your budget, when you're controlling the finances of your school, you must consider. What does that mean? That means that you have to consider the teachers. How many do you have? How many students will you put in a classroom? That will dictate the number of teachers that you have on your staff. But then what about those other things? What about your support staff? If you're in a high school, what about your counseling department? How many should you have? Maybe you think you need a college counselor, but can you afford it? Perhaps your school needs a school psychologist. Can you afford it? But let's go down, dig a little bit deeper. What about the support staff? What about the person who answers the phone? What about the person who does all the filing? Oh, yes. And what about the maintenance staff? Okay, now let's dig deeper. What supplies do those people need? Well, they might need, in the front office, they might need paper and pencils and paper clips and staplers and so many other things. What about maintenance? Well, they're going to need cleaning fluid. They're going to need supplies. They're going to need tools. Now, let's go one step deeper. Well, what else goes into making the school run? Well, you've got the maintenance of the building. What about the exterior? Doesn't need to be painted. Who's cutting the grass? Who's cleaning the bathrooms? And then you start digging deeper. Well, wait a minute. What about the cost of electricity? Well, I'm going to leave my classroom lights on all the time. Or I'm going to try to set my air conditioning because, you see, I get really hot. Therefore, I want to keep it at 60 degrees. Well, who's paying for that? So you need to, as the administrator in charge, start making policies and decisions about those things. Well, then in a private school, we also talk about, well, how do you get students into your building? Well, what about marketing? What materials do you need? I oftentimes tell people to think of it perhaps in a little bit different terms. That people generally don't think about. When you go to a doctor's office, you go in and you're there to see the doctor. But how many people does it take and what resources are needed to make that office operate? Well, you go in to check in and guess what? There's a receptionist there. Well, there's somebody doing the scheduling. Well, there's somebody doing the finances. Well, wait a minute. What about cleaning the facility? Oh, yeah. What about the furniture that we need? What about the supplies? Who orders that? Where do you get it from? And then you start saying, well, wait a minute, how many nurses do you need? How many technicians do you need? Wait a minute, let's talk about the specific equipment. How many needles do you need? How much of this particular medicine or that medicine? Well, wait a minute, if you're in a building, what about the rent? Who pays for that? That's got to be factored in. What about the heat, the air conditioning? Oh, let's not forget the water. Most people don't think about going to the doctor's office and all the things that go into making that office operational. Most times, parents don't think about what it takes to run a school. They look at you as the head of the school, and they look at the teachers and say, well, those are the only things that matter. Not really. Because without all those other things and other people, what we do as teachers, what we do as administrators would not be possible. And when you're creating a budget, you need to look at the bigger picture. What do you need to make your school the best? Then, what sources of revenue will be needed in order to make those dreams and that vision a reality? But it starts with a very clear idea of what you want your school to be. If you simply want mediocrity, well, that's probably what you're going to settle for. But in this day and age, parents aren't settling for mediocrity. Because if you're in a Catholic school or a private school, if the students don't go on to be successful, whether if they're going from elementary school to high school or high school to college, if those students are not able to be successful at the next level, guess what? Your school probably won't exist. In the public school setting, it goes like this. If your students do not do well enough on tests, and they're not able to get into college, they're not able to go into the workforce because they're not prepared, guess what? You probably won't have a job very long. It takes a lot to run a school. During the course of the next several weeks, we're going to be talking about what it takes to make sure that a school is financially viable. Because if you don't have students coming to your school, then why do you exist? If you're in a public school and your enrollment keeps declining, perhaps because there are not enough factories in your area, your school probably will close. If you're in a private school or a Catholic school and your numbers keep declining, at what point do you say this is no longer viable? And we're going to talk about the factors of viability in schools. But the burden will be on you as the head of the institution, as the leader, to make financial decisions that support your mission and your vision. But it starts with where the money comes from. If you're in a public school, don't think that you're going to simply sit back and the money's just going to roll in. Someone's going to ask you to defend that. And as an administrator, you should be able to defend every dime that you spend in your building, because that's your responsibility as the leader. You have to put controls in place to make sure that the money is spent wisely. None of us, whether you're in public school or you're in a private school or a Catholic school that's associated with the parish, we do not have unlimited funds. It would be nice to say that you do. But even with schools that have large endowments, they must plan. They must have a plan of action to ensure that their school will be around for years to come. That's the challenge of school finance. That's the challenge of school budgeting. And it's up to you. It's up to you as the leader of the school to set the tone, to set the priorities. I hope these thoughts and comments have given you something to think about as you go through the next few weeks and months. Our schools are important. If I can provide you with any clarification or you have any thoughts or comments about my presentation today, please feel free to contact me. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Again, thank you and have a great day.